Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. This is the first of the March webinars for the winter webinar series for the International Society of British Genealogy and Family History. My name is Christine Woodcock, and I'm actually going to be presenting this webinar. I'm going to be giving you an overview of the topics that we're going to cover in the Scottish course at this year's British Institute, which is being held in Salt Lake City in October this year, 2019. So let's look at some of the topics that we will be discussing. We will be looking at using Family Search. And on the Family Search website, we will be looking at using the genealogy search to find members of your family, your ancestors. We'll be looking at the various records that are available on the record search. We will be looking at the wiki, the Family Search Wiki, which is a fabulous resource. This map actually is an interactive map, and it is from the Family Search Wiki. And we will also be looking at the Learning Zone. There's just a ton of information available on Family Search, and a lot of people are not familiar with it. So we will be spending some time looking at that as a resource as well. This is some of the stuff that is on the Family Search Wiki. There are some webinars on there. So you can look at basic research strategies, old parish registers, how to access them, how to use them, how to interpret them, using Church of Scotland parochial registers, tracing difficult ancestral lines in Scotland's non-parochial register, British resources on family search, British resources on ancestry using Scotland's people, and the Scots-Irish, which was a plantation settlement in Ulster in the 1600s. We will spend some time looking at Genes Reunited. This is a website that does smart matching where you upload your family tree. Genes Reunited is run by Bright Solid, who are also the people that run the Find My Past website. And of course, we'll be looking at Scotland's People. Scotland's People is the only place where you can get the original documents and digitized images of those original documents. Everywhere else is either an index or a transcription. And on the Scotland's People website, you can find birth or baptism. Registration in Scotland, statutory registration began in 1855. So anything prior to 1855 would be from the old parish registers, and that would be a baptism. After 1855, from 1855 forward, it would be a statutory birth. For marriages, the OPR is the banns, which is the intention of the couple to marry, and that was proclaimed from the pulpit in each parish church for 3 consecutive Sundays prior to the couple actually being married. And we will look at statutory marriage records. When we look at the birth record, we will find out some of the detail in the information that's provided there, including the date and place of marriage of the parents. When we look at the marriage records, we can look at really moving back one generation, because the parents of both the spouse and the bride both the groom and the bride are listed, and that gets us one generation back in our Scottish research. We will be looking at death and burial records. So prior to 1855, we'll be looking at the burial records in the old parish register, which is mostly just Morcloth rentals. And following from 1855 forward, we'd be looking at death records and the information that's available on those. We'll be looking at the census records. Censuses in Scotland were taken every 10 years from 1801 to the present, actually. 1801, 1811, 1821, and 1831 are really just statistics. It's really just an inventory of numbers of people in the household. And it wasn't until 1841 that there was genealogical information available, and those are the ones that have been digitized and placed on the Scotland's People website. So 1841, 1851, 1861, 1871, 1881, 1891, 1901, and 1911, which is the most recent census. We'll be looking at valuation rules that you can get on Scotland's People, and these really are property assessment rules for tax purposes, and we look at the information can be provided to you if you have a good look at those. We will be looking at wills and testaments, which are available on the Scotland's People website. We'll be looking at records of corrected entry and what that means and the information that you can garner from looking at those. We'll be looking at specific things like the Scottish naming pattern, which tends to drive everybody crazy. It can either be a blessing or a curse if you know how to use it. We'll be looking at Scottish marriages and the fact that there were irregular marriages and those were perfectly legal. And we'll be looking at how to cite your sources for Scottish research. We'll be looking at some strategies to break through your brick walls. First one, of course, being creating a research plan. We'll be looking at some of the keywords that are on the document, such as occupation, whether the person was an invalid, whether they were infirm, whether they were an inmate, a pauper, or a scholar. And then we'll look at each of those, break it down to see what information we can get on them. So for occupations, we'd be looking at trades directories. We'd be looking at guild records, business records, trades magazines. Trades magazines are a great resource. And from there, you can get information about gala days, for instance. So the mining community had a gala day. That would be sort of a company picnic idea. There were parades, large gathering of people, and there were often photographs in the trades magazines. The magazines may also talk about promotions or deaths or anybody being transferred. We'll be looking at poor relief applications for those of us who have pauper ancestors. These are a genealogical gem, absolute gold mine of information that's available on them, such as the person's name, their address, their place of birth, the names of their parents or their in-laws. The reason for that is that it was expected that if you were on hard times, rather than looking for the government for a handout, you would be looking for your family for support. The names of all of the children in the home, and the occupation of everybody in the household, including parents, in-laws, and children. Children over a certain age were expected to be out working and contributing to the income of the family. If your ancestor is listed as being an invalid or being infirm, you might want to consult poor law records or asylum records. We'll be looking at those records and the information that they can give you. If your ancestor was illegitimate, you can look through the Kirk Session records. This one is quite interesting. It says in that glorious handwriting on the left-hand side there, this child at the time of its baptism could not find its father. Her mother gave it to a packman, which she said came up to her on the road from Edinburgh, though the father was suspected to be nearer the doors. But a confession from the time it was born to this day could not be extracted from the mother. So the mother was called before the Kirk Session, which is the court of the church, made up really of a board of elders. She was expected to fess up who the father was so that he could be, so that child support could be given from him rather than from the church. And regardless of the questions that she was being asked, she was not giving up the information. If your ancestor was illegitimate, the father refused to pay support, the mother may take him to court. This would be the sheriff court. The sheriff was not a police as we know it today. The sheriff, in fact, was a magistrate. And the records would show the name of the pursuer looking for the money, generally the mother, the name of the defender, generally the father, the year of birth that the child was born, any statements from the pursuer or the defender, so it'd be like an affidavit in today's courts. They would both give their side of the story. Statements from any witnesses who would have knowledge of whether the father was indeed the father of that child. It wouldn't be anybody who was witness to the event of the procreation, but in fact, anybody who may have been aware of the relationship. the year of decree, the court's decision, and the place where the decision was made. We'll be looking at a sheriff's warrant and what that means. If you see that on a document, you can see that clearly here in a marriage, where it says warrant of Sheriff Substitute of Lanarkshire, and then it gives the date. And this really is on this particular document because this couple had an irregular marriage. An irregular marriage in Scotland really was based on consent. It didn't have to be a religious ceremony. It didn't even have to be a civil ceremony. You could simply say in front of witnesses that your intention was now to be known as husband and wife, and you would be known as a couple from that point forward. And you can see on the lower left-hand side of your screen there, it says by declaration in the presence of John Drysdale, who was a coal miner, and Jane Carrick or Fowler. And those were the people who had been aware for some time that this couple had in fact been known as spouses and were in a marital relationship. We'll be looking at what you do if you find on the records things like by verdict of jury, and where to find those records. So we're going to be looking at the procurator fiscal records. Those are the records of a coroner. We'll be looking in depth at some paupers, lunatics, and criminals, and some of the various records that are available for those. So police records, prison records, court records, both sheriff court and high court, the poor law records, as we mentioned before, and asylum admission records. If your ancestor was a lunatic, in 1858, there was what's known as the General Register of Lunatics and Asylums. This is a large case book and register, and it documents everybody who was in an asylum in the country of Scotland on that day. And then it carries on with any further admissions beyond that day. There are also admission registers to the various institutions, and there are asylum records held by each individual asylum. So the information that you can get from those are the name of the person, including any alternate names that they may have gone by, surnames, maiden names, whether the payment was privately paid for or whether it was paid for by the parochial board, the date of admission, the name of the asylum, the date of discharge and to whom the person was discharged, the date of death if they died in an asylum, and any comments or observations made by the doctors. So we can see here for Hugh Crawford, he was admitted privately, so his family paid for it, admitted into the Lanark District Asylum at Hartwood. That's the name of the hospital, was Hartwood, on the 31st of March, 1899. As to cleanliness, he was clean. As to bodily condition, he was weak. As to bruises, wounds, marks, or injury, there were none. As to sores, skin eruptions, pain, tenderness, and evidence of any disease or disorder, his pulse was weak, heart sounds were distant. His tongue was tremulous, coated with brown fur. His pupils reacted sluggishly to accommodation and light, and he had varicose veins in both legs. And then it's signed by the doctor. And in 1904, poor Hugh passed away. And so written at the end of his case notes is that he expired on the 21st of June at 9 a.m. If your ancestor was an inmate, our first thought, of course, is that they would be in prison, and we would be looking at prison records. But if they were an inmate, they may also have been in an asylum, because patients in asylums were also referred to as inmates. Or they could be a resident in an institutional school, and we'd be looking at the records for that school, because children in the institutional schools would also be known as inmates. Now, we're going to have a look in depth at where we're going to find the various records. We'd be looking at some online sources for things like location, being the geographic area where the ancestor may have lived. There are a number of those online, and we'll be looking at some of those, the information that's provided. We'll be looking at occupations, the records that are available for that, and the information that's provided online. We'll be looking at online indexes and the information you can get. We'll be looking at military records, which are also available online. We'll be looking at a number of records that are now available on Find My Past. Find My Past has done a fabulous job of indexing a number of sources. They've been working very hard with the family history societies, local archives, and a number of other sources in Scotland. And really, there's a wealth of records coming on at quite a good rate. There was a number of them just brought online on Robbie Burns' birthday, which was the 25th of January. And then, of course, the most recent addition was last week, and that was the antenuptial records. And we'll be looking at a family search and the online information available there, and then some other miscellaneous records. We'll talk about researching in Scottish archives and sort of the information that you can get from them. Those archives being the National Records of Scotland, which is the National Archive. We'll be looking at local archives for each council area. We'll be looking at some of the university archives and what's available in those collections, as well as some privately held archives throughout the country. This is the National Records of Scotland. Their holdings include High Court records. Those were records that would be used if your ancestor committed a serious crime, such as murder or rape or treason. And if you have an ancestor who was transported, chances are they came before the High Court, and that's where you would be looking for records on them. We'll be looking at, the other holdings in the National Records of Scotland are the Sheriff Court records. That was for less serious crimes such as vagrancy, assault, theft. And then we'd be looking at prison records, Kirk Session records. Those have all been digitized and are available on site in the National Records of Scotland. They have not come online. It doesn't look like they're going to be coming anytime soon, but they do provide a wealth of information. We'll be looking at tax records. The National Records of Scotland is where you'll find the Procurator Fiscal records. That's the coroner, and also the coroner's jury records are in there. They have the asylum records, and that being, of course, that General Register of Lunatics. Customs and excise records, which would be important if your ancestor was a merchant. We'll be looking at researching in Scottish libraries. Scottish archives, local archives, and the holdings that they have. So they have poor law records at the local level. They have information on clubs and societies, so that would be sports teams perhaps. That would be, they would have records for them. Any local businesses that wouldn't necessarily be employees of the business, rather the running of the business. Any school records, that was from 1870 forward. Local council records, so that would be the municipal board and their records, and there's some interesting information that can be garnered out of that, and it would be amazing how often you will actually find names of local people in those council records. Police records, and the police records are not just people who have come in contact with the police, but also the personnel who are police. Local archives have prison records if there was a prison in the local community, as well as in any institutions in there, being an asylum, a residential school, anything of that nature. University archives. Each university, of course, has its own set of archives, and they have records pertaining to the life of the university. That would include matriculation records, graduation records, faculty records, faculty papers, any other major papers that sort of PhD or master students may have written, any information on university clubs, university societies, university sports teams, including photographs of those. And then each university in Scotland has its own special holding that is for the whole of Scotland. So for instance, in unique collections, the University of Edinburgh has an index of doctors that were available during World War II, as well as the records of the College of Physicians. This record is intriguing to me, and it says the University of Edinburgh, this person attended lectures on anatomy and physiology and pathology. The teacher was Alexander Monro, who was the anatomist at that time. They took 8 hours of courses. This is in 1825, and the student is Charles Darwin. The University of Edinburgh also has the records of the Church of Scotland, the New College Library, the Lothian Family History, the Lothian National Health Services. So National Health didn't start until 1948, but when National Health came on board, sometimes they took over hospitals or created hospitals in what had been asylums, and so they may have some records pertaining to them. The records belong to the National Health Services, and the archivist is hired by the National Health Services, but for preservation and safekeeping, the records are on deposit with the local universities. The University of Edinburgh has the records for the Royal Veterinary College. The University of Glasgow has the records for the Scottish Business Archives, and that's for the whole of Scotland. And again, that's not personnel records so much as the running of the businesses. They have the Scottish Brewing Archives at the University of Glasgow. So that wouldn't be if your ancestor drank beer. It wouldn't be if your ancestor owned an alehouse. It would in fact be if your ancestor worked in a brewery, such as Tennent's. They have the records, the archives for the Glasgow Guardian, which is the newspaper for Glasgow. They have the records of the Scottish Friendly Assurance Society, and that's important because this was an early insurance society, and often when people were looking for assistance to pay passage to come to the colonies or to come to America, they would turn to their Friendly Assurance Society to see if they could get some money from them, sort of on a loan basis. So those records can be very, very helpful as well. The University of Stirling has the records for the Scottish Newspaper Society, so that would be editors. They have the Penguin Books archives. Do you remember reading Penguin Books? Those archives are at the University of Stirling. They have the records for the Forth Valley District Asylum, the Stirling District Asylum, and also for the Royal Scottish Hospital, which is the hospital for the mentally impaired. Dundee, the University of Dundee. Dundee is known for jam journalism, and so anything to do with those three industries, the records are at the University of Dundee. Records to do with the Tay Bridge disaster are available there as well. They have the Tay Valley National Health Records, the records for the Dundee Royal Infirmary, the Dundee Women's Hospital and Nursing Home, the Royal Dundee, which was the lunatic asylum in the area, as well as the Perth College of Nursing and Midwifery. And they have poorhouse records. There was a poorhouse in the area. The University of Aberdeen had been two separate colleges. Back in 1495, King's College was formed, And then in 1593, Marischal College was formed, and those two amalgamated to become the University of Aberdeen. And so the records for each of those two colleges are available at the University of Aberdeen. And they also have the holdings of the Scottish Catholic Archives. So those archives used to have their own separate building and their own separate archivists. Those that disbanded, and they have now been placed for safekeeping, the majority of them with the University of Aberdeen. They have the records for the Grampian National Health Services. And they have some emigration records. This is not comprehensive by any means, but you will find sort of some scant records here and there, particularly newspaper reports, actually, not listing people, but certainly listing boats and places that they've left from and how many they're taking. For any of the port cities, Aberdeen being one of those, Aberdeen, Dundee, the Orkneys, Oban, Glasgow, Edinburgh. You can see from there, sometimes they will have some records to do with people leaving. And again, it's not ships' passengers lists because those didn't come into being. It used to be when our ancestors came prior to 1870, which is when steamships started. Prior to that, they were merchant ships, and so the majority of the information had to do with the merchandise that was being moved back and forth across the seas. However, there are certain circumstances where the merchant ships were specifically outfitted to take some people on board as well, and those would be, for instance, the prisoners, anybody who was captured as a prisoner of war. Thinking particularly the prisoners of the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, the Battle of Worcester in 1651, when they all came into Massachusetts. Anybody who was transported would be on one of the ships that had been specially outfitted. Again, still a merchant ship, but there would be a listing. And then anybody who came over part of the colonial emigration, or who was brought over as part of the Highland clearances, perhaps, where large groups of people came, then they would be in specially outfitted merchant ships, basically in the belly of the boat, and they would come over on those. However, the University of Aberdeen does have an online database for emigration. It is not comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination, but is absolutely worth a look. You simply go to the University of Aberdeen archives, have a look through there, type in emigration up at the top search bar, and you will get an opportunity to insert your ancestor's surname, hit search, and see what comes up. It's always worth a look. The University of Aberdeen also has information regarding the slave trade. And again, most of the port cities do have those. So Aberdeen has them. The University of Aberdeen has them. The University of Edinburgh has them. I believe it's the Glasgow City Archives, actually, that have them as opposed to the university. So anywhere really where there was a port and there were merchants who were trading not only in merchandise, but also picking up slaves from the Caribbean, particularly sometimes from Africa, and taking those to North America to work on plantations. We'll talk about researching in Scottish libraries. This is the National Library of Scotland. Also university libraries and local libraries. The National Library of Scotland is a deposit library. It's the National Deposit Library, and it's not a lending library, but they have a wealth of records available. Some of their holdings include newspapers for the whole of Scotland, maps for the whole of Scotland and beyond the shores of Scotland, actually. They have a number of special collections, magazines, directories, history books, manuscripts, and reference books. So a manuscript, if you're not sure what a manuscript collection is, if you were to take everything that you've done in terms of your genealogy research, so the obituaries that you've collected, the documents that you've collected, the photographs you've collected, the stories that you've collected, put those all in a box, that was then become a manuscript collection. So it is pertaining to one topic, but it really is just kind of a higgledy-piggledy of different pieces that you've put together to do your research. We're going to look at different ways to map your Scottish ancestors, including the National Library of Scotland maps. We'll be looking at gazetteers and the information that you can get from gazetteers. We'll be looking at the statistical accounts of Scotland and the information that you can get from them in terms of where your ancestor lived. And we'll also be looking at town plans and estate plans. This is the website for the National Library of Scotland. It is by far the best website out there in terms of maps. As I said, it's not just Scottish maps. They have maps from a number of different places, and it is absolutely fabulous. You can go in and look for maps by county. You can look at town plans and views. Some of those early town plans, if you zoom in, you can see the names of the proprietors listed right on the building, right on the map. There are ordnance survey maps, there are coastal maps, and there are military maps where they sent somebody out after the English sent Roy out after the Battle of Culloden to map the roads up into the Highlands, seeing that the Highlanders had an absolute advantage in knowing their way around there and the English didn't. You can browse by map maker. Most people don't do that. You can find by place. You can look at side-by-side maps, so you can look at georeference maps. You can georeference a map. You can take an old map and you can overlay a modern map on top of it, and you simply use a slider and you will see what was there right up to the new Google Earth image that is currently there for that area where your ancestor lived. Now, if your ancestor was living in the Highlands or your ancestor was living on the islands or some rural area, chances are very little has changed over time. However, if your ancestor was living in a more urban area, like a city like Aberdeen or Glasgow or Stirling or Edinburgh, then there is more likely to be change as growth in the area itself has required changes to be made to the buildings. Also available digitally online for the National Library of Scotland are broadsides. Broadsides were really 8.5 by 11 sheets that were the newspaper of the day. And, you know, people talk about Scots being illiterate, and in fact, they were not illiterate. They were avid readers. That was part of the Reformation, was being able to read your Bible. You think by 1650, when the Battle of Dunbar soldiers came over, for instance, Scotland already had 5 universities. So certainly you're not looking at an illegitimate, you're not looking at an illiterate community at all. Excuse me, my throat. So they had broadsides, I'm sorry, and the broadsides, as I say, they were sort of the story of the day. They would be read, they would be shared among the community at perhaps while people are waiting in line to get water at the wellheads, or they may be talked about in the markets and then pasted up on the stalls. And those are for just a ton of information. You can get them all digitally on the National Library of Scotland website, and certainly gives some credence to the times that your ancestors were living in, and really a special insight into this. This one is one of my particular favorites. Margaret Dixon. Margaret Dixon was a fishwife. The life of a fisherwoman was not an easy one. The husband would be out for a week or two at a time, fishing, and when he came back, so while he was gone, she would be raising the children and looking after any animals that they may have had and any crops that they may have had. When he came back, she would be the one to clean the fish, gut the fish, fillet the fish. The fish would then be put in a large woven creel, so it was like a bamboo creel that she would wear on her back with straps, and she would walk that into the local market. Maggie was in Musselburgh, which is about 6 miles outside of Edinburgh, and so she would walk into town once or twice a week, hawking her fish. Maggie learned at some point that her husband had gone missing and was in North Berwick, which is on the coast, just north of the English border. What Maggie didn't know at the time was that her husband had in fact been pressed into service with the Navy. Maggie set off to go and look for him. On her way down there, she stopped. She needed a place to rest, and she said to the owner of the inn, "I have no money, but I'm happy to work for my keep." And Maggie was put to work. She was cleaning rooms. She was pulling beer at the bar. She served food, and she actually did very well and was very well liked. Maggie stayed there for quite a while. She had an affair with the owner, the owner's son, the owners of the inn. She had an affair with their son. Maggie became pregnant but didn't tell anybody, because she knew if she told anybody that she would then be, she would lose her job. She'd be sent packing. So Maggie didn't tell anybody, and a couple of days after Maggie had given birth, a dead baby was found on the shores of the canal. Now, Maggie says that the baby was born stillborn. However, after some detective work, it was decided that the baby was in fact born alive. Maggie had killed the baby, and Maggie is taken into Edinburgh, where she is tried and convicted for the murder of what it says here, her bastard child. Maggie's sentence was that Maggie was to be hanged. Part of the Anatomy Act of 1842 allowed that, so this certainly is before 1842, but part of what happened was um, they didn't have, when the anatomy department was trying to learn how the inner workings of the body functioned, they didn't have x-rays, they didn't have MRIs, they didn't have any of that sort of stuff that we have today, of course, and they would actually have to open the body up. And of course, we can, we've heard stories about the body snatchers who would take the bodies out of the graves, take them to the anatomy department for some fairly decent coin, and really could make more in that one act, that one criminal act. They could make enough money to support themselves for a year, really. So what tended to happen was that people who were criminals, their bodies were given over to the anatomy department, and anybody who was a pauper who didn't have a family, their bodies would be given over to the anatomy department as well. Maggie's family didn't want that to happen, and so they came in from Musselburgh to claim Maggie's body once she had died. So it's the day of execution, the Grass Market, the gallows of the Grass Market in Edinburgh, which is the main market area at the time, just below the castle. Maggie climbs up on the scaffolding. She walks along the plank. The rope is put around her neck. The floor opens up. Maggie flails around for a bit, and when she stops flailing, her body is cut down, and her body is handed over to her family who have come from Musselburgh. Maggie's family put her in a coffin, and they put the coffin on the back of a cart, and they start to walk their way back to Musselburgh with this oxen cart. Partway there, they decide that they need to stop. They need to have a break. It's been quite a day. They are going to stop and have some lunch or some dinner. They push Maggie's cart up under a tree, and they go into the inn where they have a meal and a drink. They come out and they hear knocking on the coffin. They open it up, and of course, Maggie's not dead at all. Maggie has survived. Now they're in an absolute panic, and they hightail it back around. They go into Edinburgh. They don't want to be seen with absconding with a convict, and so they take Maggie back to Edinburgh. They meet with the judge, and they explain to the judge what has happened. The judge says that Scottish law is that Maggie has to serve her sentence. Maggie's sentence was that she was to be hanged, and Maggie was in fact hanged. The fact that Maggie's hanging didn't take is not Maggie's fault, and Maggie from that day forward was free to go, but she was also known around town as Half-Hanged Maggie. And those sorts of stories are the stories that you can get through the broadsides available through the National Library of Scotland website. They have newspapers for the whole of Scotland, as I said. This is a newspaper clipping to do with my great-great-grandfather, William Carrick, and his son, Andrew. They were killed in a mining accident. They were at the end of their shift, and they were just a few feet. They were on the lift coming up to the mouth of the mine, and they were just a few feet from the mouth of the mine at the end of their shift when the ropes let go and the lift fell to the bottom, basically ending up as nothing but toothpicks in the bottom. And both William and Andrew and the other man who was with them wound up dying as a result of the accident. Now, I knew from their death that they had died. I knew that they had died at Greenfield Colliery. What I didn't know were the circumstances. And those circumstances I discovered on a website called Scottish Mining, where I was able to access the mine inspector's report. And the mine inspector's report had, of course, said that the lift had let go, even though it had been functioning normally and was not all that old. It had, for whatever reason, the cable had broken, and Andrew and William had plummeted to their death. I also, though, discovered through reading the newspaper article to go along with it that there was, in fact, a third person on there named Tommy Docherty, and Tommy Docherty had said that this would be his last shift. It was his first shift, and he had said it would be his last shift. There was not going to be any more mining in his world. He was not cut out for it, and he had no interest in returning. And of course, he never got the chance because he died before he had the chance to actually leave the mine. Also at the National Library of Scotland, you'll find a number of manuscript collections, published and unpublished family histories. They have the Scottish Screen Archive, which is available online on their website. And it sounds like, you know, it's motion pictures, but in fact, it's everyday film, and it's more home movies. So there may be films in there of gala days for the miners. There may be films in there of local parades, local company picnics, local ballet recitals, Highland dancing, just a number of things that could be on there. There's actually a film on there of the ferry going back and forth from Skye, from Oban to Skye. So really, it just gives you a real sense of the life that your ancestors were living in, and who knows, you may even find your own ancestor in some of those films. The published and unpublished family histories are available actually online on a website called Internet Archive. And I'll show you that in just a moment. And the National Library of Scotland also has some estate papers. The largest collection they have, of course, for estate papers is the Sutherland Estate, which was the largest estate in the Highlands to be cleared. It's on the east side of the Highlands, and it also was the first to be cleared. And the factor was absolutely notorious, just ruthless in the way that he did the clearing. And really, he's the reason that the Highland clearances have such a bad name. So the published and unpublished family histories that are at the National Library of Scotland are available on the Internet Archive website, which is at archive.org. And when you go in there, this is what you'll get. And you can scroll through pages and pages and pages of this. And of course, you can flip through each one of those books. They've all been digitized. We'll talk about emigration and the different reasons that people left Scotland. People who were perhaps prisoners of war, either as Covenanters in the 1600s or as Jacobites in the 1700s. We'll talk about military recruitment, where people were brought over to protect the colonies. We'll talk about life before the clearances, the Highland clearances and the Lowland clearances, also the clearances on the islands, the Western Isles, which took place at a different time. We'll talk about people who were recruited for work, land opportunities, people who came over as British home children, various emigration schemes, and chain migration. So the Covenanters were in the 1600s, as I said. They were a very large group, actually countrywide. It was a number of academics, scholars, lawyers, doctors, who got together in Edinburgh, Greyfriars Church, and they decided that they were going to sign what's known as the National Covenant. And basically what that was saying was that they were not going to follow the rules of the Church of England, where the reigning monarch is the head of the church. The Scots believed that God is the head of the church, and they were going to keep it that way. They were not going to become Anglican. They were going to remain Presbyterian. And they signed this oath, and they sent this right around the country to be signed. The English didn't like that, of course. Oliver Cromwell, parliamentarian, rounded them up, and some of them were shot on the spot, executed on the spot. Some of them were hanged, some of them were burned. There are a number of them who were rounded up and were imprisoned at Greyfriars in the kirkyard there. About 1,200 people were imprisoned there. It's open to the elements, and they were, shoulder to shoulder, and it was really quite a brutal life. A number of those were slaughtered. The ones who survived were slaughtered to be transported to Barbados or to the colonies, and some of those came over as the Dunbar soldiers. Some of the Covenanters, not the ones that were in Greyfriars, of course, the ones that were rounded up in Dunbar, which is on the coast just above the English border, they were taken down, force marched down to Durham Cathedral. There were 6,000 men who were rounded up. 3,000 of those died en route. 3,000 arrived at Durham Cathedral. Of those, about 1,600 died in captivity, and the remaining 1,400 or so were to be transported. The first group of them were a group of about 248 who came over to Massachusetts, and 62 of those 248 that came over were sold to the Saugus Iron Works, and they worked there primarily in the sawmill there. We'll look at life before the Highland clearances, what the Highland townships looked like, the community effect. We'll look at the clearances, what happened, why they left, why they were cleared. We'll look at clearing the Isles, which of course happened about 20 years, 30 years later than the Highlands. People who were then transplanted to the colonies because they would have died had they remained where they were. Because Canada remained a colony after the Revolutionary War, a number of people came in to the United States through Canada. They may have come over as recruited men from the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company set up a recruiting merchant in Stromness in Orkney, and the men were indentured for 5 years. They went out to York Factory in Manitoba, and from there many of them made their way south, or they returned back to Scotland. We'll look at the Selkirk settlers, where Lord Selkirk brought a number of Highlanders, displaced Highlanders, over and helped them to settle in the Maritimes and then on through to the Red River settlement near the HBC. We'll look at the Huron Tract, which is a large tract of land in Ontario, and we'll look at the Canada Northwest Company, which was land along the Canadian National Railway lines out west when the railway helped to open up the west for settlement. And finally, we'll look at some cultural considerations for those who are researching Scottish ancestors, help to put your ancestors, their lives in a bit more perspective for you. We'll look at things like superstitions. I guarantee you that the Scots are the most superstitious people on the planet. We'll look at some of the celebrations and traditions that they have, and we'll also talk a bit about clans and tartans. And so that is going to fill our week. That will fill the mornings. In the afternoon, of course, we will be over to the Family History Library where we can do some research on site. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box and I will answer them as best I can. Also, make you aware that below or just above the chat box there is a handout from this presentation. If you're not able to download that, please just send me an email when we're finished and I will be happy to email you a copy. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, just to remind you that the next webinar for our winter webinar series is on the 16th of March. It will be at 11 a.m. Eastern, and Beryl Evans from the National Library of Wales will be talking to us about using Welsh church records for genealogy research. Somebody's asking if I mentioned the Great Rate at the Plaza. I believe it's $99. That's on the website, the International Society for British Genealogy and Family History. So it's isbgfh.org, and on the left-hand side, there's the menu for the British Institute. In there, you'll find the rate for the hotel and the fees for signing up for the institute itself and the 4 courses that are being offered. I'm just starting with my research on my Scottish family. Will we be able to have a consultation? Yes, absolutely. Consultations will happen for each student, and that's regardless of which of the 4 courses you're taking. You will have the opportunity to have a consultation one-on-one with the instructor to get some guidance around your research. We have a webinar that was done last month by Claire Brisson Banks, who worked in the British Isles Department of the Family History Library for a number of years. It is freely available on our website under the British Institute link. I would highly recommend that you have an opportunity to view that so that you're not feeling overwhelmed when you get to the library, and you'll have a better sense of what you can get there and where to start and what sort of records to be looking for. So it's most people will say that when they first get there, they don't know where to start, and so it takes them a day or two, and they would rather not waste that day or two. So we're working to get them prepared ahead of time if we possibly can. If you have raised your hand, please just type your question in the chat box. I'm not able to respond to raised hands because of the muted mic. Perfect. Somebody's just saying they want to try again working on their Scottish ancestry. So that's wonderful, Sandra. Okay, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of questions, so I thank you for your time and your attention. I look forward to spending a week with you at the British Institute, and we will see everybody in October. This webinar has been recorded. It will be available on the website, and you can review it at any time. Just a reminder again that the program runs in October from the 14th to the 18th. The mornings will be class time, and then the afternoons will be research time in the library. The library is also available some of the evenings, and you can research there as well. And every student who is enrolled gets a consultation with the instructor to help you in your research. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you all again.